Welcome to Let's Talk Cardano, presented by the Cardano Foundation. In each episode, we delve deep into the transformative world of blockchain technology. Join us as we explore how blockchain is reshaping industries from finance to supply chain and talk with some of the key pioneers at the forefront of this revolution. All right here on Let's Talk Cardano.
Welcome. My guest today is Massimo Morini. He's a professor of blockchain and maths for finance in 3 universities. And he has been advisor at different institutions such as the World Bank and the Monetary Authority of Singapore. He was head of modeling at the largest Italian bank for more than 10 years. And he served as chief economist for the Cardano Foundation for 4 years. Massimo, tell us about your time in banking.
My time in banking was very long, first of all, because it was not really my first experience with markets, because already when I was at uni, I had a job that helped me with my studies in which I was using models in financial markets. And that was extremely useful for my future, because that period of time has remained in history as the dot-com bubble. But I do not really remember it as a bubble. It was an incredible moment in which we could invest in those companies like Amazon or Yahoo that then built the internet. And for the period in which I was doing that job, the portfolio that we were suggesting to clients had stellar results. But as it often happens, in very innovative areas, the moment in which they are built is a moment in which just a few really manage to win, while many others disappear. But in any case, those resources are almost always reused by those that buy them, by the same entrepreneurs when they restart. So that was my real approach with markets. And probably because of that, when at some point I decided to take a PhD in maths, I was immediately curious about application in financial markets. And so I took subjects like stochastic calculus, data analysis, AI, that at that time was, in a sense, still at the beginning compared to what we see now. And it was still during my studies that I happened to meet some mathematicians that were working in the largest bank of my country. And I found that job extremely interesting. We were writing papers, publishing very interesting results. I could learn how to manage risk, how to model markets, and at the same time apply that in practice. So then I joined them to work with them. Very rapidly, I took responsibility of entire areas of modeling: interest rates, credit, inflation, foreign exchange. That was such an exciting time that probably at some point, I think, the sector became sort of too successful. We were probably helped by the fact that we were modelers, we were mathematicians, but it was obvious that behind some products, behind some financial structure that were also sold heavily through the retails, behind the maths, the assumptions were actually too optimistic or overly simple. And there were, for example, some new products, new markets, like the one related to mortgages, where we did not want to invest. But that did not save that world when at some point everything around us started collapsing. So about my time in banking, I remember an exciting time where, probably partially also because of that, at some point, the level of analysis or the correct level of risk management became too low. And then another period that I remember as, in any case, a period in which I could learn a lot. That is the period of the crisis. I wrote a book in those years, to explain what, in my opinion, was the best way to use models and the risk that one was using when using mathematics, in a sense, to interpret markets. And so there was the exciting beginning, and then there was the incredible turmoil about the crisis. And that, for me, was not only a transformation of myself, it was also a transformation of the banking world. Because as a reaction to the crisis, the regulators and in general the government intervene in the financial market not as you may expect, to prize the best behaviors or to punish those that had made mistakes. That happened only a little. It was more a matter of taking control of something that had created problems and over-regulating that. And it was a massive distortion. I wrote some of the first papers and even a book collection of papers on how the interest rate market for a period was completely distorted by the intervention of the government. And then there were new approaches that were standardized in a sense by regulators that, in my opinion, were very good. But also they created new risks because everyone was forced, in a sense, to use the same approaches. At that time, I did a lot of interesting things. For 7 years, I was an advisor, for example, to the World Bank, because in that period, these kind of supranational institutions were becoming extremely important. The truth is that banking as an independent, competitive sector was disappearing. And so in the end, I've come also to the end of my experience in banking, or near end.
That's a good segue for the next question. How did you get into blockchain? What did you see in this world?
Well, I think that at some point I was asked by my traders, particularly the interest rate traders, to explain them, in a sense, what was one of the biggest distortions that we could observe at that time. That were negative rates. Negative rates seemed to be in contrast with the intuition that most of the people in the market had about rates. And the questions was, okay, we believed for years that rates were bound to zero. There had been extraordinary moments where rates had been negative in the past, but not at that level, not for all that time. And so they wanted to know if this was something that was there to stay. And also, if the old bound that they could use in their strategies, the lower bound of rates, was something around zero, what was now the new bound? Minus 1%, minus 10 basis point, minus 10%, minus infinity. In studying the problem, I realized that one of the main reasons why something like that was possible is that in the modern world, everyone is using electronic money for the majority of its use of money. So physical money is becoming more and more irrelevant. And that was already true in those years. In that peculiar situation, if a central bank, in order, in a sense, to give a sort of boost to the economy, decide to set rates to a negative level, no matter how dramatic this can be for your savings, you cannot leave banking, because at that time, the only form of electronic money, electronic payments that you could use were all going through banking. That was really sort of upsetting and sort of unsettling for a person working in that sector. And it was exactly at that time that I found out about something that looked like an alternative. And that was also, in a sense, my answer to my traders. I said, guys, so far we are in a situation in which rates can go dramatically negative without big reactions, because we cannot leave banking and put everything in cash. But maybe an alternative, electronic money without intermediaries that cannot be controlled, is developing. And if something like that happens, this period of negative rates will finish. That was my very beginning, my very discovery of Bitcoin. And in a sense, I think that at that moment for me, the dice were tossed.
What year was that when you...
2014.
2014. What was your point of contact? Did you read the Satoshi Nakamoto white paper or some of your friends?
Yeah, we were talking because a few people in banking had immediately the perception that that topic was related to banking and the future of banking. And think that after that, I read a paper wrote by a colleague that regarding the stability of cryptocurrencies. And that topic was also my first piece of research. I think it was the first paper that pointed out that if you want to create stability in something like a cryptocurrency, even if you have the possibility to making everything algorithmic and so on, you need sort of another asset, a sort of collateral to give stability to a currency, because that's something that I had learned in the fiat markets. But also at that time, remember it was 2014, Ethereum was being born. So after Bitcoin, I started looking at Ethereum because Vitalik was already quite a person, in the Bitcoin world. I also had the opportunity to invite him at a conference, and having a panel together in 2015, I think. And smart contracts opened up another really moment of insight. I realized that with this technology, collateral, so important for today finance, could be made automatic, could be made much faster, much efficient. And this could have solved a lot of the problems of financial markets, the problems that were left after the crisis. I wrote a few papers with the attempt to convince the banking world about the importance of this technology. They had some effect. I was noticed by the American regulators that mentioned my paper when explaining to the Senate what blockchain could do. I was one of the first board members of R3, that consortium of banks that wanted to incorporate blockchain technology in banking. But it was probably too late. The sector was no more very competitive, as I told you. Was, in a sense, was very, very regulated, but also very protective. And there were no real motivations to solve some problems, in such a radical way. And I started moving more towards the world of public blockchain. In the end, I did a test market for derivatives with automated collateral on Ethereum. And after that, I never really left the public blockchain.
You mentioned R3 and private chains. I remember at my time at UBS, also the talk was we cannot afford to go on a public chain. We need to investigate private chains like R3 or Hyperledger. Why do you think those solutions never became successful?
Under many points of view, they were good solutions. I'm still listed among the few dozen people that contributed to the creation of Corda. And still today, I think Corda has some tooling that is very interesting, for the application of ledgers to financial markets. But there was not enough courage, There was not really a step towards a seriously decentralized system, which is paradoxical because a seriously decentralized system could be, even today, really a saving in cost for banks. But that system, using some of the best pieces of blockchain technology, but without putting them, in the right decentralized, uncontrolled context, ends up being a waste of resource rather than a saving.
Can you make the case for public permissionless layer 1 blockchains and why we should use those rather than private chains?
The truth is that in that period, from being in banking and working with private chains, I started to work with public chains while in banks, forcing a little bit that word to test them. And at some point, I decided to leave and move and join a public chain. Of course, as it always happens in life, also public chains have their difficulties, particularly for example, when I joined Algorand a few weeks after launch, I ended up being in the middle of a sort of supply crisis, with a spiral of the price. And I'm still considered one of the 8 founders of the foundation. I've got my name in the Genesis block. The truth is that I joined a few weeks later, finding everyone so much surprised that my background, in markets could be useful. We thought that we were going to work mostly, about application for banks, that part of my background was going to be useful. It was different. It was my knowledge of markets, my knowledge of models for the stability of markets that became more useful. again, another period in which I could learn a lot. I had the privilege, in a sense, to change some of the initial design to stop the spiral. And I was surprised by how effective, in an algorithmic world with a limited supply, it could be, for example, really to act on that. When we stopped the supply with one of the first votes in blockchain, really price decline stopped. And then we built algorithms in order actually to decentralize, to increase the supply without having disruptions. And I think that this example can show why banks have at times perplexity, to join public blockchains. They still fear this market instability. And on the other hand, if well managed, the presence of tokens is a crucial element, to create a decentralized system, because it allows to base it on economic incentives and not on the fact that regulators force you to do something. It allows you to distribute the cost across participants that voluntarily participate and maintain the system. And I've got to say that during some years, I think that it was very, very successful to join together in the public blockchain the experience that I had learned in banking. And I used many of the risk management rules, and also for the management of the Treasury, for example, of the rules that limit wrong investment, that stop taking excessive risk. And in supply, I realized how important was the possibility of making it algorithmic, of making it transparent, of making it predictable. So yes, the case is that banks or institutions or projects that have experience in the financial world should come to the public blockchain world and develop there. But the fundamental thing is that they have to change their approach, So they have to use everything they have learned, but learn something more, which is associated on how to create a system that works based on predictability or the usability of its algorithms and the effectiveness of its incentives to have participation. And this is not necessarily easy to do, but allows to obtain results that would be impossible if one remained in the traditional world. And on the other hand, I think that the blockchain world has to understand the importance of some of the good practices that there are in financial markets, that we tend to think that they are regulations. And it's true that in blockchain, traditional regulations do not make so much sense. But through technology and through good practice, exactly the same principle can be enforced also in blockchain. I think that there is still the possibility to have this match between the traditional regulated world and the public blockchain world.
This seems you're speaking about decentralized finance. You want to go away from the banking world and get on the blockchain.
Well, decentralized finance.
DeFi seems to be the answer to that. But with the current stablecoin regulations and all the crackdown on certain protocols, it seems that some banking is creeping into blockchain. Can you maybe tell us some anecdotes on some project you worked on, some stablecoin or tokenization? What's your take on DeFi in 2024?
Think of what I mentioned before. All of my initial research was about using blockchain technology to make collateral more effective. So allowing this to move really faster, and faster in terms of settlement, because with collateral settlement that you want to stop risks, and making it automated, avoiding, the uncertainty and the delays of the partial agreements of traditional contracts, but towards the automation of smart contracts. And even with such a perfected collateral, the possibility to create stability of a currency with a prudent, because we also had experiences of non-prudent using collateral, even in cryptos, unfortunately. But with a prudent, we have good examples, like MakerDAO. With a prudent approach, you could even get such results. And did you see anything like that happening in finance? My first paper were on derivatives with almost zero credit risk thanks to this technology. They were not visible in traditional finance. But look then at DeFi. What happened a few years later? Takes the business of borrowing lending. How can borrowing, lending happen in a decentralized world where you don't know who is your counterpart. It's thanks to automated and fast collateral. Exactly the same principles that were in my first paper. So obviously DeFi for me was a great satisfaction. And in the last few years in Algorand, in which I had no more responsibility about Treasury and so on, I focused a lot on building the DeFi ecosystem, the governance ecosystem. And definitely, I think that the results that DeFi has obtained are amazing, and they are definitely something at which the banking world needs to look, but it's looking. It's definitely looking. You mentioned regulators, Someone recently pointed out in a post a few words that I used in a conference this spring, a little bit after that MiCA, the European regulation about crypto and blockchain, had been released. And when you open this regulation, which is an extraordinary effort that I strongly support, you see this definition for crypto assets. The crypto asset is the representation, the digital representation of a value or a right. You think of Bitcoin, Bitcoin is a digital value, and it's a digital object that allows you to do things. Is not the representation of a value in the digital world. It's the digital value itself. And the rights it gives you are enormous, but they are not representation of other rights. They are part of owning a Bitcoin. So from the very first definition, you still think that some more understanding is needed between this technology and regulators. On the other hand, you mentioned tokenization. This definition absolutely fits what a tokenized product is. A tokenized product is supposed to be a digital representation through blockchain technology, so that doesn't require an intermediary to make transactions, for example. Digital representation of a value or an asset that are usually originated not in the crypto world, not in the digital world. So I think that even if this regulations maybe do not really understand the world of public blockchains or the world of cryptocurrencies, they do understand the world of tokenization, and they give a lot of support to its development. And that's probably what was missing, because tokenization is a dream that has been going on for several years, but something was always missing, to being able to bring value into the digital world from outside, while you have seen how much value has been created inside the digital world by itself.
Okay, where do we start from to tackle this big topic of tokenomics and Cardano?
We may start from the beginning. The beginning is essentially when Cardano was launched, and it happens for almost all crypto projects that the tokenomics somehow starts at launch. It's very hard to correct any mistake that was done at launch. Can be done, but it's hard. And also the good things that you do at launch actually give you advantages potentially forever. And I think about the launch of Cardano, a very good thing about that is that more than 50% of the tokens was distributed at the very beginning. Other chains, and I see many projects even today that, in my opinion, run the same risk, hold much more undistributed tokens, after launch. And this is a risk under several points of view. It's a risk of centralization with all the shortcomings of centralization, mismanagement of the resources, wars for control of resources, inconsistency when actually, the management of the resources changes in terms of people or in terms of strategy. So it's hard for decentralized projects to have too much resources centralized. And then there is an actual tokenomic risk. These resources that are distributed could be at any time, be distributed and create turmoil, create inflation spirals, they generate uncertainty. Thanks God, in a sense, Cardano distributed more than 50% at the very beginning, at launch. But it's even something more. because of what wasn't distributed, only a very small part was kept centralized at the founding entities. To say the truth, the amount was extremely small for the foundation. There are foundations, in the crypto world that hold still the majority of the tokens years after. I think that for foundation was around 1% or even less. And then there was an amount that has been used in the following years for the development of the technology, but more than 30% of the original 45 billions, and say 70-80% of what was not distributed was put in a reserve. What is a reserve? A reserve essentially is an amount of resources that meant not to be distributed outside a precise distribution schedule. I would say that an example could be Bitcoin, in a sense. In Bitcoin, essentially, what wasn't distributed could only be distributed at regular times, by the way, for the distribution of rewards. Cardano was similar to that up to a point, but since it wanted to have some of the qualities of Bitcoin, but not some of those that are seen as its limitations, in these rewards, the distribution is algorithmic, but with some elements of change that can react essentially to potentially different inputs. Even if, to say the truth, the configuration has not changed a lot, so it has moved in a fairly predictable way since let's say the Shell era, when consensus started and also rewards started to be distributed. And the other thing that Cardano thought about was that this reserve should not only be released regularly for rewards, but also for the building of a treasury. And what is a treasury? And what's the difference with rewards, with reserves? Essentially, reserves are meant not to be distributed outside a specific schedule or a specific, while a treasury instead are still resources in a sense that are set apart for the future. But they can be spent and they are considered part of the circulating supply. But using them require very specific processes or procedures. So before, the Voltaire era, which is starting now for Cardano, there was multi-sig in order to use the treasury. That was pretty hard to use. And from now on, there needs to be votes with specific restriction and rules in order to release these resources. Why I think this is very, very important? Because they protect the chain under several points of view. One point of view, clearly, is tokenomic. Is a protection against the risk that wrong decisions create unexpected inflation, turmoil, uncertainty. Then they protect the decentralization, avoiding abuse of resources, avoiding them to be spoiled, by mismanagement. And then, obviously, they actually really help the tokenomics for the long term. For example, the reserves in Cardano that release every epoch a very small amount are also the sort of nominal value which is used to compute rewards. So a little bit as it happened in Bitcoin, also the rewards in Cardano are regularly decreasing towards the moment in which the chain needs to become fully decentralized and sustainable. And that's a sort of education towards scarcity for the whole community. And it makes sure, however, that these resources will be available for a very, very long time. And about the treasury, that's different, but in a sense fulfills the same kind of requirements, because the treasury instead is going to grow in time. And so it reaches an important amount exactly when some investment may be needed at some point to then allow the chain to be decentralized, to be autonomous, to be sustainable. That's basically the period in which Cardano is entering now, with Voltaire. And to say the truth, it's hard to find any other chain that planned this in the same way. Several chains have something similar to reserves, but I don't think there are other chains that really for 3 years, I think that the initial value of Cardano reserves was around 13, 14 billion ADA. And from the very first 3 years, essentially that was untouched until the Shell era when the decentralization of consensus started. And after that, the release has been very, very regular and very gradual, very algorithmic. And now it's even going beyond that, decentralized governance managing that, but we already see from the constitutional debate that there will be very clear limitations and checks and balances of power. And not to mention the Treasury, because when the Catalyst paper and design came out, that was a reference, for all other chains about how to build a Treasury and a decentralized Treasury. So definitely when we talk about this design of Cardano, we are talking about the best in class. And let's look at some pictures that allow us actually to understand a little bit better how this system works. Let's suppose that we start from an hypothetical epoch 1 or 0 of the chain. At that moment, at launch, some of the resources can be distributed and become part of the circulating supply, and all the rest is reserve. The proportion we see in this drawing are not those of Cardano, because as I said, even at the beginning, the circulating supply was more than the reserve. But we need to focus on the reserve, so I've been making it a little bit bigger than it was in that case. In moving from Epoch 1 to Epoch 2, part of the reserve is released. It goes into a sort of pot, which in fact is called the pot or reward pot, which is actually increased also by the transaction fees during the epoch. And then, as we were saying, is distributed both to the rewards, as it happens with Bitcoin, for example, to all the new release, but also for a smaller part towards the Treasury. So essentially what happens in Epoch 2? It happens that the reserve is a little bit smaller, then we are going to see the numbers with Cardano, and you will see that here I am sort of increasing the changes compared to what they really are, but that's for educational purposes, essentially. And so the reserves shrinked, a treasury was born, and a certain amount of rewards has been released. Why there is essentially just a dashed line between rewards and circulating supply? Because rewards are actually part of the circulating supply that may not be spent, by the validators, but they are formally part of circulating supply. Treasury, that may not be very visible, but I've used some dots on the background. They are not fully white as the rest of the circulating supply, because Treasury is formally circulating supply, but it is also very different, because it cannot be readily spent in an unpredictable way. We know that there are always been, and there will be even stronger rules in the future in order to actually use the Treasury and potentially move it towards the market. Notice that the amount of rewards is actually larger than the amounts of Treasury, and that's true. But at the same time, notice that while there is a straight line, from the pot to the Treasury, there is a circle called F between the pot and the rewards. Why? Because a certain amount is actually allocated to the rewards every period. But then, since the rewards are so important as incentives to the right behavior of validators and other operators, there are several adjustments to the rewards that can be done depending on the behavior of the validator. So then the amount that really becomes rewards is usually smaller than the one that goes out of the pot to become rewards, and the other part returns to the reserves. Next epoch, from Epoch 2 to Epoch 3, the same thing is happening, as a cycle. The pot, very difficult to see in the picture, but the pot has become slightly smaller because it's a percentage of reserves that are slightly smaller. Treasury is growing. Rewards for the epoch are slightly smaller than they were in the previous period, but they add up to the previous rewards and they increase somehow the circulating supply. Then it's about time to put some numbers here. And I've put the numbers that are probably most important in understanding the dynamics of Cardano Tokenomics. As I was saying, the amount of reserve which is released every epoch is very small. It's just 0.3%. And that is what goes into the pot, which is increased by the fees. And then we have the distribution between rewards and treasury. And here we have a 20% going to treasury and an 80% going to rewards. These numbers are those essentially that have driven the dynamics of Cardano since launch, and in particular since when, with the Shelley era, rewards started to be distributed and reserves also were used to build the treasury. However, these numbers are not written in stone. In fact, they are parameters. They are pretty popular parameters in the community. Rho is the parameter that decides, is the rate of release of the reserve. And tau is the parameter that decides the distribution of this release between treasury and rewards. These are the parameters that I've put in this chart as black parameters, not only because they are the most important, but also because every period they are always the same. Rho is always 0.3%, tau is always 20%, 1 minus tau is always 80%. However, there are other parameters in the protocol that can make some smaller or larger adjustments to the flow that do change every period because they do depend also on external things. The first parameters of this kind is eta, which is the one that we see beside rho, in the first row. And that's basically the ratio between the actual number of blocks that were created in an epoch, divided essentially as a fraction of the theoretically ideal value of, in a sense, a block every seconds, every slot. This number is always very near to 100%. It few times has been even higher, but there is a cap in this case for eta not to be higher than 1. But in any case, it's always, most of the time, slightly smaller than 100%, so as a very slight adjustment to rho. Then parameter tau gives a quite correct representation of what every period goes to the treasury. Obviously, you have to take, starting from the reserves, the parameter rho, which is the release, the parameter eta, that is the adjustment, the parameter tau, which is the amount devoted to treasury. You multiply one by another, and you actually get the release of the treasury. There is more dynamics in distributing rewards, because in this case, we are not only talking about some money which is set apart for the future. That's the immediate incentive and compensation for the operators that are essentially running the chain. And here there is a formula that we will analyze later in this podcast that essentially checks how optimal has been the configuration and the behavior of the pool operators and all the participants to the consensus protocol. For the deviations that may have been seen, in the chain, the formula applies an adjustment. So in order to understand what goes to rewards, you also have to consider another sort of parameters that I've called theta, because it's a Greek letter like the ones that have been used for the other parameters, which is a sort of synthesis of the effect of other parameters that we will see later, and that adjust the rewards. Everything which is undistributed because of the incentives to good behavior of the pool operators goes back to the reserve, and increases it back, towards the amount it had the epoch before. So in a sense, it's like multiplying this amount for a 1 minus theta sort of coefficient. And the same is repeated, in the next epoch. And now that we look at these parameters, we have to understand the incredible importance of having parameterized this flow. Because that's something that can be incredibly stable as it has been incredibly stable until now. As I was saying, in the history of Cardano, in the first 3 years, there was the construction of the consensus methods, the building essentially of the smart contracts. And in 2021, we saw the beginning of the decentralization of validation, and even the first example of some decentralized governance with the creation of Catalyst. After that, essentially, for example, the black parameters have never been changed. So regularly, this has been the flow that everyone could expect, everyone could predict. But towards a world of decentralization, it becomes important to understand what to do if any of these parameters need to be changed. Thanks to the fact that the most important steps have been parameterized, these can be rather easily given out as a decentralized opportunity for a community. And now Cardano is really busy building rules, a balance between some more flexibility to empower the community, but also the strength and the predictability that we have seen so far with stable parameters. The other parameters which blue also, even if they have a variability, and I've been analyzing them also in their variability, and I have to say that even if they change epoch by epoch, they are always quite near to the expected value that you can guess, in looking at how they are defined algorithmically. Also, these parameters can be changed, working on the parametric structure of Cardano. So it's absolutely important, to show them. We will probably do a deep dive on the parameters in the next episode or in the next episode, but allow me to do a little bit more breakdown even during this episode. Fees, for example, also depend on parameters, because in Cardano, the basic fee has a component that is fixed for every transaction, which is called B, and also a component that depends on the bytes of a transaction. So in a sense, then you have a sort of linear function, A times the amount of bytes plus B. And I'm talking of simple transactions. Then at some point, we will also see the transactions that involve the usage of smart contracts that also contribute to the fees. And then let me a little bit start, revealing the reality and the mechanics that under the hood is in the circle that I have indicated by F. Here, different parameters are at play. One parameter, P, observes and adjusts rewards for the proportion of active stake compared to the total stake. We know that Cardano is one of the most successful blockchains in terms of participation to staking. I think that the amount of staking nowadays is still around 22, 23 billions, even if now the circulating supply is more than 30, if we look at how much has been released. Yet, as you see, there is a gap. P, in a sense, is the ratio that captures the adjustment for the fact that not all the circulating supply is active. K is a parameter that controls decentralization, because it's an optimal number of pools. Deviations from these optimal numbers cause automatic algorithmic changes to the distribution of rewards, depending on then how much every pool is near or far to a sort of optimal state. A0 controls a very important aspect, because we know that Cardano is characterized by delegated proof of stake protocol, where delegation is very important and allows everyone to participate to consensus. But at the same time, also the participation with own resources, like in more traditional sort of mining logic, is prized in Cardano. And A0 essentially controls this aspect. We will see some more analysis of the formula later on. Again, we see that this repeats in the next period, in the next step from epoch 2, from epoch 3. And if you like mathematics, you can start thinking in a sense on how these parameters multiply by each other, in given the dynamics, how they can be designed, as a differential equation. First, actually, finite difference differential equation, and we can see that probably we can design them also as stochastic differential equations. Obviously, we are talking of something that it's not, in my opinion, complex, because it only deals with the crucial important points in a tokenomics that needs to be observed, but certainly is not easy to grasp in a single moment, just looking at one slide. I think that it is worth also looking at the situation in one single epoch. So what happens in one single epoch? We have this amount of reserve, which is released in an amount which is raw, or 0.3% that multiplies eta, which is a proportion between actual and optimal blocks, which is always very near to 1. And then this release takes two different possible ways. One, tau goes towards the treasury, and that's compensated by an analogous tau proportion of the fees that have been paid by the user. Another amount, 1 minus tau, goes towards rewards, but remember that there are a number of adjustments that we can summarize in the multiplication by a theta ratio. Theta is a synthetic letter that maybe has never been used, with this purpose, that I use in order to synthesize, the effect of A0, K, P, and all the other parameters or in any case variables that we have seen before. And then what happens to the residual 1 minus theta amount of the rewards, the one that come from eta times rho times 1 minus time times 1 minus theta, this amount goes back to the reserves. Also, the fees contribute to the rewards, because there is a 1 minus tau proportion that actually reaches this amount. Notice that, obviously, if tau is 20%, 1 minus tau is 80%. When we talk about the distribution of fees, or when we talk about the distribution of other components of the rewards, in a sense, we always have to remember that this is adjusted by the incentives to optimal behavior of the validators. A little bit more details in the next slide, because there are some more smaller flows that, however, it's important to be aware of. For example, the rewards that become unspendable for some technical reason, for example, a pool that receives the rewards but then cannot operate and so they cannot be spent, go to the treasury. They are not lost. And similarly, the deposits that pools need to actually put on chain in order to start acting as pools, if they are unreturned, they also go to the treasury. On the other hand, from the treasury, obviously, there can be decentralized withdrawals, following the precise rules that are the characteristic by which the treasury exists, and that, goes, like fees come from the community using the chain, the decentralized rewards go towards the community, usually to increase its usage in terms of new project, new developments.
Thank you. That was a great recap. To give a quick overview of the size of the pots, I did a quick calculation at the end of epoch 505. An epoch is it's exactly 5 days. So the current size of the treasury is 1.5 billion. In US dollar, that's $500 million more or less. The annual replenishment rate of the treasury, it's 345 million. And as you mentioned, every year will be replenished a little bit less. The amount is growing because the treasury is not being spent. So with the new governance model on chain, we might see the treasury decreasing in value. But at the current rate is being replenished 345 million. The annual reward, so the incentive given to the stake pool operators and the delegation of the stake, is 639 million. Which is not the 80% of the parameter, is not 4 times the treasury replenishment rate because of the variable you mentioned. And this was quite useful to know. The data comes into play. And then the transaction fees I looked at the last 365 days. Paid was roughly 7 million ADA. That goes into in the pot that serves Treasury and reward. I guess this now gives an idea why governance is so important, why now we need on-chain governance to regulate the access to the Treasury. Do you want to add something to that, or?
No, governance is extremely important. So governance is extremely important, in my opinion, for two reasons. Because many see decentralized governance, and we had some examples, in the past, as, so things that work well now will be in the hands, of someone that is not maybe prepared. That's the typical comment of the community. But a well-designed decentralized governance is a way to preserve, because changing is going to be difficult. It requires correct process, checks and balances. It requires certain majorities. And at the same time, changes at times are needed. And I have been in a situation which myself, that I always focus so much on the fact that supply and everything about tokenomics needs to be as much as possible algorithmic, fully transparent, predictable. However, at times it has been crucial to change. And therefore, it's very important that a debate and a full understanding of these parameters goes on in order to also go into the directions of change that will be required, by the needs of the chain. There are several aspects, that will change in the future, change dynamics. For example, you mentioned the amount of fees, That's an amount that will change, very, very likely in the future. And, think that the amount you mentioned, 7-8 millions, is similar to the one that is given out for rewards, even for an epoch, So that's something that needs to be taken into account into the balance. You mentioned the fact that theta is very important, So an analysis of these parameters protects, in a sense, the chain from excessive inflation. In some cases, may actually, however, lead to a compensation for validators that may, considering also how the world around the chain changes, be considering some periods small. And let's not forget that all these parameters globally have an effect on the stability of the market. They can be elements of inflation, or in some cases, elements of deflation. So that's an extremely interesting field where I think the community will really enjoy this possibility, to given by this incredible design that has been created and kept for more than 6 years now, and that is probably the most complete parameterization. I wouldn't talk just about blockchain. I cannot think of another experiment in the history of humankind in which there was really the building of a society, an economy that can be seen algorithmically, and where at the same time, the humans that use it can intervene into it. That's, I think, what makes this moment of Cardano particularly fascinating.
I wish the budget of Italy was run in this transparent.
I would like many budgets, today and in the past, to have been run in this way. Many, many budgets, even without going too far away from the blockchain world. Yes.
Thank you very much, Massimo.
Thank you. Thank you, Giorgio. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for joining us on Let's Talk Cardano. For more insights and deep dives into the world of blockchain, don't forget to subscribe and reach us at cardanofoundation.org, where you'll find extra resources and content on all things blockchain. Leave us a review wherever you enjoy podcasts. Follow us on social media and stay tuned for more coming soon.